I am delighted, I'm honored to have the privilege of sharing a few thoughts with you this evening. But before I begin, I have to say that I'm here to address you as an individual citizen. I'm not representing any organization or any group. I speak to you today as an elder, and as an elder, I assure you I have no hidden agenda. Elders, I believe, are really important because they have something no other group in society has. They have lived an entire lifetime. And so I believe that it's time now for elders to enter the most important time in their lives, to troll through a lifetime of experience for those nuggets so dearly paid for of knowledge that we must try to pass on to the coming generations. And that's what I would like to try to do in the next few minutes. You see, today's generation of young people is absolutely unique in all of human history. They spend the least amount of time outside of any generation in history. They have lost that deep connection with the natural world. In Canada, the average child today spends 8 minutes outside and more than 6 hours in front of a television, computer, or iPhone screen. And it's not just kids. I have a friend in Toronto who lives on the northern edge of the city in a high-rise apartment that's completely air-conditioned. And he tells me he goes down the elevator in the morning, into the basement, into his car, which is air-conditioned, drives down the Don Valley Freeway to the basement of his commercial building, goes up to his office, completely air-conditioned. That office is joined by tunnels to huge shopping areas and grocery stores. He literally said to me, "David, I don't have to go outside for weeks." That's the kind of world that we are living in today. But you know, we only fight to protect what we love. And how on earth will we fight to protect nature if we don't even know the role that she plays in our lives? I grew up in London, Ontario in the 1950s. There were 4 children in my family, my mother as well as my mother and father, house of less than 1,000 square feet. And that was not an exceptionally small house. That was considered a normal house in those days. But it was a small house. When I was growing up, around 5:30, you'd see back doors open and moms and dads would be yelling for Johnny or Mary because we were out there. But of course, we haven't created an environment. We've got a very car-friendly environment in cities, but one that is not child-friendly. So our houses are bigger. There's a lot more room now. You know, in the last 40 years, the average size of a Canadian house has more than doubled. And in that same time, the average size of a Canadian family has decreased by 50%. So that means the average person today in a new house has 4 times as much room as we did 40 or 45 years ago. And what do we need all that room for? Well, we got a lot of stuff to put in it. And Johnny or Mary can have their own area and do their own thing. Because we don't want our kids to go outside, right? Because we're afraid that they might be hit by a speeding car, or there might be a pervert lurking behind the bush, or they might pick up a discarded injection needle. Or we've made it very child unfriendly. I think that we've got to start thinking about the way that we live in such a way that being outside is a part of our daily lives. You all know, I know that there is no need to explain to you that we need to be in the company of other species. A city is a place that is so homogenized now, it's basically a monoculture of human beings. Very, very few other species around us. Now there are whole books that have come out showing the benefits, the mental, the physical benefits of being outside or even being in the view of trees and other species. Years ago, when we were fighting over one of the watersheds to stop logging or prevent logging, I encountered the CEO of the the logging company that was given a license by the provincial government to log this watershed that we were trying to stop. And when he recognized me, we got into a rather animated discussion that very quickly elevated into a shouting match. And finally, in frustration, he said, "Listen, Suzuki, are you tree huggers willing to pay for those trees? Because if you're not willing to pay for those trees, they don't have any value till someone cuts them down." And that, for me, was an epiphany, because I realized that in the culture that we live in, he is absolutely right. And so environmentalists struggling to try to protect forests are left to saying, you know, the forest company can easily say, well, there's X number of board feet and X number of tons of pulp and so many jobs and so much profit. They can give you an itemized list of the economic benefits of logging that forest. And we're left with saying, well, if we wanted, we might be able to find some mushrooms and some berries, and maybe we could find some medicines in 10 or 15 years. And, ecotourism. But of course, this is absolutely terrible, because the real reason, the real benefits of the forest don't come in those economically definable ways. As long as those trees are standing and healthy, they're taking carbon dioxide out of the air and putting oxygen back in. Not a bad service for an animal like us. If that wasn't happening, of course, we wouldn't be here. Those trees are extracting water out of the soil and transpiring that water into the air and affecting weather and climate. Those tree roots are clinging to the soil, so when it rains, that soil doesn't run into the spawning beds of the salmon. That forest is providing habitat for countless insects and fungi and birds and mammals, and all of those things are provided as services by that ecosystem. And yet, from an economic standpoint, we can't quantify that or argue. And so it's really an uneven discussion when we enter into that kind of a debate. Environmentalists, I think, have struggled by being caught up in trying to argue through the same value system, trying to justify why we want to reduce greenhouse gases. Well, we'll save money by being more efficient, not using as much fossil fuel, and the air will be cleaner, so our health bills will be lowered. We're constantly forced to justify our position in economic terms. But the services performed by healthy ecosystems are not evaluated in the same way as one would derive from looking at it from strictly a resource management perspective. In the last 10,000 years, the last 5% of human existence, we underwent the agricultural revolution, which transformed the way humans live on this planet. In 1900, there were 1.6 billion people on the planet. There were only 14 cities with more than 1 million people. In only 100 years, we underwent another major transformation, comparable to the agricultural revolution. By the year 2000, there were now 6 billion people in the world, 4 times as many people, but there were over 400 cities with more than 1 million people. The 10 largest cities in the year 2000 all had more than 11 million people. In 100 years, we have gone from being an agricultural creature to a big city dweller. And in a big city, our perspective changes very much. In a city, our highest priority becomes our jobs. You need a job to earn the money to buy the things that you want. And so the economy then becomes our highest priority. And we forget that the very word economy comes from the Greek word ekos, meaning household or domain. And ekos is the word from which ecology is derived. the study of our household or domain, our domain, because we're a species that's not fixed to a specific ecosystem. Our domain is the biosphere, the zone of air, water, and land where all life exists. And what ecologists try to do is study species to determine what are the critical elements, what are the conditions, the principles, the laws that enable a species to survive and flourish. But when we say, as our Prime Minister has said repeatedly, we can't reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that's crazy economics. It'll destroy the economy to do that. When we say we have to clear-cut forests on a large scale, or we have to drag heavy weights and nets across the bottom of the ocean in order to be globally competitive, when we say that we have to spread pollution into the air, water, and soil because that's the price of doing business, we elevate the economy above the very things that keep us alive. It was Rachel Carson's Silent Spring that came out in 1962 that made many people realize the repercussions of that rapid growth in the peacetime economy through consumption. Her book, Silent Spring, was all about the unexpected effects of pesticides. And I personally was just beginning my career as an assistant professor in 1962 when that book came out. And it profoundly impacted my life. Because what she showed was that we're a very clever creature. We can invent these powerful insecticides. But when we spray out on the fields to kill pests, we don't realize that everything in the world is connected to everything else. And so, yes, it does kill pests, but it kills all insects that come in contact with that compound, and it ends up affecting fish and birds and human beings. By the 1960s, breast milk in North American women was considered too toxic to feed to babies. Millions of us were swept up in the modern environmental movement as a direct consequence of Rachel Carson's book. And you know, when her book came out, there wasn't a single department of the environment in any government on the planet. The word environment didn't mean what it has come to mean today. But as a result of that environmental movement, we've got departments of the environment from the federal through the provincial to the municipal level. You simply can't ignore it as an issue. We have laws designed to protect the air, to protect water, to protect endangered species. And millions of hectares of land, and some of the oceans are now protected as parks or reserves. And that was a consequence of this explosive growth in the environmental movement. And I remember celebrating victories that I was involved in various ways, in small ways, in fighting, in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge up in Alaska, right next to the Yukon. It's the calving grounds of the porcupine caribou herds, one of the great gatherings of mammals in North America. And when the oil in the North Slope was found in Alaska, then eventually pressure came to drill for oil in ANWR, in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And I think we did 3 shows on the nature of things. Each time we heard there was pressure to drill, we'd do a show on the biology of ANWR and show the value of the porcupine caribou herd. And we beat back that pressure. There was a proposal to drill for oil in Hecate Strait, and I joined with the First Nations on the coastal communities. But we then raised a lot of noise and stopped the proposal to drill in Hecate Strait. There was a proposal to build a dam at Site C on the Peace River, and we stopped that. There was a proposal to bring the oil from the North Slope of Alaska down the coast of British Columbia in supertankers to Seattle to be refined in Washington. My wife and I got very involved in the fight against a series of dams that was to be built in Brazil with a $500 million loan from the World Bank. And working with the Kayapo Indians in the Amazon in Brazil, we stopped we got the World Bank to withdraw its proposed loan to Brazil. So we celebrated these great events as great victories. And yet 35 years later, guess what? Every one of those issues is back on the agenda. Indeed, Brazil now said, we don't need a loan from the World Bank. Our economy's doing fine. We're going to build those dams on our own. And as you well know, the dam at Site C is now well on its way to getting started, although there's going to be a big fight, I believe, over that. But we're committed, I think, in British Columbia to building that dam to power the LNG plants that are also being proposed. So what does that mean then? We fought those battles and we thought we won them 30 years ago. And the reality is that we failed. Environmentalism has failed because we remained in the same arena. We remained within the same value and belief system, the belief that the economy was the dominant priority, and we argued within that same arena. We didn't shift the paradigm, as you hear this cliche. We didn't change the way we see ourselves on the planet. And it simply can't work because we haven't changed the paradigm. What is our absolute primary priority, our highest need that we have as a species? And this is something I tell children. You know, what was the very first thing you needed the moment you left your mother's body? And of course the answer is a breath of air. And from that moment on to the last breath you take before you die, you need air 15 to 40 times a minute. If you don't have air for more than 3 or 4 minutes, you're dead. If you breathe polluted air all the time, you're sick. So surely clean air should be the very highest priority we have, regardless of what your area of vested interest is. Can we not, as an organism, can we not agree that clean air is our highest priority? And of course, then I tell children, try going for a week. No, I shouldn't tell them that, I guess. Try going for a week without taking a drink. And of course, we couldn't do that because we would be dead if we didn't have water, because each one of us is between 60 and 70% water by weight. But the problem, of course, is that our bodies leak water, right? It comes out of our skin and our eyes and our mouth and our crotch, and we lose water all the time. And so we're constantly imbibing water. And where do we think that water comes from? It's not British Columbia water. It's just temporarily here in British Columbia. It's cartwheeling around the planet through the hydrologic cycle. And we just happen to be biological creatures that have become a part of the hydrologic cycle. Without water for more than a week or so, you're dead. If you have to drink polluted water, you're sick. So surely protecting clean water should be a high priority. And you can go down the list then. As biological creatures, we need food, and most of that comes from the soil. So again, protecting the soil and protecting diversity of life is critical. So we are created by these absolutely critical elements. And if we don't begin our discussion about how we're going to live in the world, by all agreeing, those surely should be our greatest priority in protecting, because without them we can't live. And if we don't protect their cleanliness, we're sick. Air, water, soil, and sunlight through photosynthesis, and the diversity of plants and animals around the planet that cleanse, replenish, and create those 4 sacred elements. Earth, air, fire, and water is what I've been taught by our Aboriginal brothers and sisters. So I believe that we have to stop all of this fighting. You're going to see a huge fight brewing now over the LNG plants. The huge fight over what we're going to do as a port. Are we going to ship coal, the dirtiest fossil fuel? Are we going to become a port for coal? These fights are going to happen. And I believe that if we don't leave our vested interests outside the door as we begin to discuss these issues, and all agree that our highest priority has got to be air, water, soil, biodiversity, sunlight, those are our greatest needs. And they must become the foundation of the way we live to protect those, because without them, we're either sick or we're dead. Then we begin to build how we live socially, how we create an economy that will protect, above everything else, those fundamental things. If we don't begin the conversation that way, I simply think it's going to be, we're going to fight these battles over and over and over. Well, can it be done? How much time do I have? In both Ecuador and Bolivia in South America, they have now enshrined Pachamama in the Constitution. Pachamama is Mother Earth. Now, it's not surprising in Bolivia that this would happen because the president of Bolivia is the first indigenous person, Evo Morales, elected to be head of a country. But Ecuador is a very interesting country. They are an oil exporting country. The president, Correa, has a PhD in economics from an American university. And when he was elected on the promise of rewriting the Constitution, he was the one that approved the inclusion of Pachamama in the Ecuadorian Constitution. So what does that mean? It means in Ecuador and Bolivia, trees and birds and fish all have a constitutional right to exist and flourish. Well, how does that play out then? Their big national park is a park called Yasuni, and it's on the east side of the Andes Mountains, right at the headwaters of the Amazon River. And it has the highest level of biodiversity of any ecosystem on the planet. And I spent 4 days filming there, and I can tell you it is amazing. I mean, in one day you may see 6 species of monkeys, and birds, of course, of every sort, and insects. Anyway, it's an amazing park. 1 million hectares in Yasuni, and they discovered a huge deposit of oil under Yasuni. So President Correa, this economist, said, well, if we dig it up, we'll destroy the park, and nobody wants to do that. And if we then burn it, that'll simply add to more global warming. So why don't we leave it in the ground? $7 billion worth of oil we'll leave in the ground. And so he said, we're willing to leave it in the ground and take a hit for half the value of that oil. So we'll absorb $3 billion of the value of that oil. We'll forego that. But will the world help fund us for the other $3 billion? Will the world contribute to keeping the oil under the ground? Now, they set up an account in the United Nations, so the Ecuadorian government, as politics change, can't get into that and start looting that fund. The UN is administering it, and it will live on the interest of that fund to fund renewable energy in Ecuador, to fund the native communities that live in and around Yasuni Park, and to fund restoration and extension of the forest out into the areas that have already been destroyed by oil development. So they said, we are asking the world to contribute $300 million each year for the next 10 years. They've passed the first year, they got $300 million. So it's a very interesting experiment to see who will cough up the money and whether will be able to sustain it. Compare that with Canada. We have the second or third largest deposit of oil in the world in the Alberta tar sands. We're spending now billions of dollars. The only thing the federal government is investing in to deal with climate change is carbon capture and storage. But wait a minute now. Nature already did that. The tar sands are the carbon pumped out of the atmosphere over hundreds of millions of years and stored. It doesn't make any sense to dig it up, liberate it back, and then try to capture it and put it back down. Geez, can we not be at least as original as Ecuador and say, let's leave it in the ground and find other ways? And let me end by saying that's one of the reasons why Peter Robinson is leading the David Suzuki initiative to get a constitutional amendment and enshrine the right to a healthy environment in our Constitution. And I believe this is a very, very exciting initiative. And on its surface, you might think, well, who could be against having a healthy environment? Of course, we're all for that. But when you realize that a healthy environment means that our rivers and our lakes are intact, our forests remain intact, that we have to protect nature at all costs if we're going to have a healthy environment, there is going to be one hell of a fight. But in the process of this discussion, I believe we will have the arguments made that could lead us to a fundamental paradigm shift. At least that's my hope. And all of you that are involved in the parks, you are an absolutely critical part of this battle that is going to go on in the coming years. So thank you for doing what you're doing, and thank you for allowing me to share a few ideas with you.